Appendix A. The Disastrous Quest for Scientific Common Ground. Quote, together with thinking of the results of science as they are offered to us in various fields, we must think of the methodology of science. Perhaps there is greater agreement among scientists on the question of methodology than on the question of results. At any rate, it is quite commonly held that we cannot accept anything that is not consonant with the result of a sound scientific methodology. With this, we can, as Christians, heartily agree. It is our contention, however, that it is only upon Christian presuppositions that we can have a sound scientific methodology. And when we recall that our main argument for Christianity will be that it is only upon Christian theistic presuppositions that a true notion of facts can be formed, we see at once that it is in the field of methodology that our major battle with modern science will have to be fought. Our contention will be that a true scientific procedure is impossible unless we hold to the presupposition of the triune God of Scripture. The chief major battle between Christianity and modern science is not about a large number of individual facts, but about the principles that control science in its work. The battle today is largely that of the philosophy of science." End quote. Cornelius Van Til. What I argue in this appendix will alienate a lot of my readers. I argue that the methodologies of the scientific creationists and the modern Darwinian evolutionists are remarkably similar, and that this has compromised the scientific creation movement. On the surface, this may seem preposterous, both to the scientific creationists and the Darwinian. Nevertheless, the similarities are there, and they should not be ignored, let alone deliberately concealed from the public. The fundamental agreement concerns the doctrine of uniformitarianism. Quote, natural laws never change. End quote. Natural laws are seen as universal, the same in this region of the universe as in any other. The trouble is, neither side agrees with the other with respect to the scientifically legitimate applications of these natural laws. The creation science movement uses certain arguments with respect to the second law of thermodynamics in its attempt to prove its case against evolutionists that the evolutionists also use against the creationists. Both groups use two basic approaches: closed systems versus open systems, each mutually contradictory with respect to that fundamental debating point, the meaning and proper use of the second law of thermodynamics. Both sides affirm that 1. The second law of thermodynamics has only been shown scientifically to operate in closed equilibrium systems. 2. All local systems are ultimately open systems. 3. Insofar as science is concerned, the universe is a closed system. And 4. The universe is therefore running down. Whenever one side attacks the other by using a variation of the quote-unquote closed system argument, the other side responds with, "You can't say that because this particular system is an open system." So the arguments get nowhere. Neither side will allow itself to be pinned down in any given instance by the logic of the second law of thermodynamics. I have argued in this book that Christian cosmologists' reliance on the entropy concept has placed them perilously close to the social theory of Jeremy Rifkin. In fact, this dependence on the concept of entropy has made the creation scientists virtually defenseless against the bulk of Rifkin's pessimistic conclusions. The terms of discourse. As used in popular books, for example, Jeremy Rifkin, Henry Morris, entropy is spoken of as a law that proves that all of nature is decaying, wearing out, and becoming increasingly random. The quote-unquote noise of the universe is overcoming its original coherence. The forces of life, growth, and heat are steadily losing to a purported counterforce, the second law of thermodynamics, death, decay, and randomness. Such a heavy reliance on entropy has led to a paralyzing social pessimism within the creationist movement. In fact, it is this unstated presupposition of eschatological pessimism of the bulk of the scientific creationists that has been a major incentive in their adopting entropy as the linchpin of their argument against Darwinism. The appeal to entropy has become the key apologetic tactic in the movement. The social pessimism of the more consistent humanist defenders of this popularized version of entropy is matched by the equally consistent social pessimism of Christian defenders of entropy. It was not a coincidence that in his 1951 book, The Bible and Modern Science, Henry Morris begins with a chapter on the entropy law. Quote, "The physical universe is beyond question growing old, wearing out, and running down," end quote, and ends it with a chapter defending the Bible, an apologetic approach based on the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It is fitting that a chapter on prophecy should be included in a book on the Bible and science. Prophecy is closely linked with a person's worldview. Eschatology sets the tone for consistent natural science. Eschatology also sets the tone for consistent social science. Charges and countercharges. Defenders of God's six-day creation have constantly appealed to the second law of thermodynamics in order to demonstrate the absurdity of believing that the autonomous operations of an impersonal, increasingly random, and disorderly universe could have led to an increase of order and coherence, meaning the conditions necessary for the supposed evolution of life. They argue along these lines. Quote, "The Darwinian evolutionists claim to be scientists, but they ignore the operations of what is probably the most fundamental law of science, the second law of thermodynamics. They refuse to appeal to God to explain the origin of life, an order-producing, increasingly complex phenomenon, which must be regarded by consistent scientists as an unexplainable, impossible event in a truly autonomous universe that is governed as a whole by an invariable law of decay and increasing randomness. Thus, they are not truly scientific, for they refuse to apply this invariable scientific law to the study of origins. This shows that they apply scientific laws selectively. This illegitimate selectivity, therefore, shows that they are not really disciplined by a rigorously scientific methodology." End quote. The Darwinian responds with arguments along these lines. Quote, "The creationists claim to be scientists, but they constantly appeal to God's miracles in order to explain historic events. They cannot prove the existence of God, and they cannot offer evidence that would enable us to explain how God interacts with the world. They even deny that his miracles are subject to the restraints of predictable scientific law. Nevertheless, they claim to be scientists. This is nonsense. They are only pseudo-scientists. They do not govern their scientific inquiries by the second law of thermodynamics or by any other scientific law. They apply scientific laws selectively. This illegitimate selectivity shows that they are not really disciplined by a rigorously scientific methodology." End quote. I think these arguments are very similar. They both focus on the same issue: the opposition's failure to adhere to a methodology that applies absolutely fixed scientific laws to all the available empirical evidence. I intend to show that the arguments on both sides are so similar and initially so compelling intellectually that it should lead Christians to reconsider the whole approach of trying to apply absolutely fixed, impersonal laws to all available evidence. Both sides cannot be correct. Something must be wrong somewhere. Since neither side is willing to stick to the rules, yet both claim to be rigorous, quote-unquote, scientific, in their approach to questions, perhaps there is a more acceptable and more honest methodology which allows us to be selective in the application of the familiar regularities of nature, yet still be truly scientific. Maybe absolutely fixed impersonal laws do not really exist. In short, we need to ask ourselves, what is the proper scientific methodology? We also need to ask ourselves, what does the Bible tell us concerning law? How binding is the entropy law? What is entropy? Henry Morris writes, quote, "There are three basic vehicles of physical reality associated with the entropy concept. In the structure of all systems, entropy is a measure of disorder. In the maintenance of all processes, entropy is a measure of wasted energy. In the transmission of all information, entropy is a measure of useless noise. Each of these three concepts is basically equivalent to the other two, even though it expresses a distinct concept. Always, furthermore, entropy tends to increase. Everywhere in the physical universe there is an inexorable downhill trend toward ultimate complete randomness, utter meaninglessness, and absolute stillness." End quote. In short, entropy is a measure. The scientific creationists argue that because the world is naturally running down, becoming more and more disorderly, it follows that evolution through impersonal nature cannot be true. There has been an increase in order, not a decrease. Thus, the universal second law of thermodynamics testifies against the possibility of Darwinian evolution. The Darwinists reply that the acknowledged fact of the second law of thermodynamics cannot legitimately be used to call into question the idea of biological evolution through natural selection. Yes, the universe as a whole may correctly be characterized by increasing entropy. Nevertheless, a local region can sometimes escape the effects of an increase of entropy, at least temporarily, because of outside energy entering it, and therefore it can experience the quote-unquote progress of increasing complexity and order. They usually argue that the universe as a whole is running down, although segments of it can postpone entropy's effects for a while. I say usually, but there are occasional exceptions. Evolutionist Michael Ruse responds to the scientific creationists' appeal to the second law, but he responds judiciously. Quote, "The second law obviously applies only to closed systems, but, argue evolutionists, given the influx of usable energy from the sun, the organic world is an open system. Hence, evolution is possible. Entropy may be increasing through the universe taken as a whole, but it does not mean that in some localized areas entropy cannot decrease. The world of organic evolution is one such area. The sun shines down on the earth. This makes the plants grow. Animals live and feed on the plants, and thus life goes forward." End quote. This is a theory of quote-unquote sunshine evolution. Note that Ruse does not assert that entropy is increasing through the universe taken as a whole, but only that it may be. He carefully guards his academic flanks with that seemingly harmless word may, a pre-attack defense so subtle that hardly anyone will notice what he is implicitly admitting, namely, that modern science cannot prove that the universe as a whole is characterized by increasing entropy. It is also interesting that he devotes only half a dozen brief paragraphs to this crucial but difficult topic, unlike Kitcher and Young. He displays considerable wisdom in this regard. This Darwinian argument based on open regional systems is denied by virtually all scientists who are six-day creationists. But it is a necessary component of any scientifically rigorous Darwinian refutation of creationism. How seriously should we take sunshine evolution? Not very, says D. Russell Humphreys. He argues that the heat entering the Earth's atmosphere increases entropy, just as heat applied to water raises its temperature and therefore increases the disorder among the water molecules. Quote, "Evolutionists want the sun's energy to produce greater and greater order upon the Earth. This requires that entropy be decreasing in our open system. But solar energy does just the opposite. It increases the Earth's entropy." End quote. In short, quote, "Since there is such strong experimental evidence that the second law applies to all systems, open or closed, living or non-living, creationists do not need to grant the evolutionists the ground of possible exceptions to the second law of thermodynamics." End quote. This is a representative response by a scientific creationist. The point is, the Darwinian explains the operation of the second law of thermodynamics as exempting their most important theological point, namely, the possibility of organic evolution in a world of entropy. "Foul!" cry the scientific creationists. "Fair!" cry the Darwinian evolutionists. It is not my task as a social theorist to go into great scientific detail beyond my competence. The apologetic problem, the philosophical defense of the faith, that faces the scientific creationists is that they have criticized the Darwinian for ignoring the second law of thermodynamics, but the Darwinian sometimes appears to be using it in a scientifically acceptable way in their search for an escape hatch, the argument against open systems. Classical thermodynamics does deal with closed systems, and only with closed systems at equilibrium. Thus, the Darwinists seem to get the better of this phase of the argument. On the other hand, they sometimes abandon classical thermodynamics in order to solve problems raised by the scientific creationists, especially the key question of the world of biological change. If scientific creationists continue to insist on trying to expose their opponents by using their opponents' arguments against them, it would be wise to select a better example of Darwinian weakness. The creationists have pointed repeatedly to the impossibility for the cosmos to have had enough time to evolve, given presently observed rates of change. This does strike a major blow against the Darwinists, but to focus on the second law of thermodynamics rather than on the Darwinists' overdrawn bank account of available time has not persuaded many conventional scientists of the case for creationism. The two camps shout at each other endlessly over the proper use of the second law. It would be cheaper and waste less time for each group simply to buy an endless loop cassette and play the recordings at each other. No one would listen, but it would give everyone more time to develop more effective arguments. It would also get Jeremy Rifkin out of the picture. Uniformitarianism, the shared faith. Why all this concern about the extent of entropy? Because the Darwinians base their case against the creationists on the logic of uniformitarianism, and the scientific creationists reply in kind, almost. Uniformitarianism is the scientific religious doctrine that the laws of nature are fixed. Uniformitarianism asserts that the laws that govern all historical change have been stable over time. Without such fixed laws, both sides claim, there could be no science. The debate begins. Scientific creationist Henry Morris states that to the best of our knowledge, all the laws of nature have been in effect since the beginning of time. At least he admits that this is to the best of our knowledge. He argues, however, that the evolutionists' presupposition of a world of constant change, of evolutionary flux, is a denial of these fixed laws of nature. Evolutionist Willard Young counters this argument. Quote, "Evolution is a process which occurs under appropriate conditions within the laws of nature as they stand. Rather than suggesting that the laws of nature evolve, it assumes on the contrary that they have remained a constant. Except for this implicit assumption, the theory of evolution has nothing whatever to say about any of the fundamental laws of nature." End quote. At least he admits that the fixed laws of nature are assumptions. Morris could easily argue that this assumption is not warranted by the inherent presuppositions of Darwinian science regarding cosmic change. How does the flux of nature's processes produce fixed laws? How does anything remain fixed in a world of change? Therefore, Darwinian science really cannot assume what it needs in order to be scientific, fixed laws. But then Young could respond that scientific creationists are only part-time believers in fixed laws, for they believe in miracles, God's intrusions in history that temporarily overcome fixed laws, indicating that such laws are not actually fixed. They are fixed, quote, except when God interferes, end quote. We are now dealing with that age-old philosophical problem of structure and change, of law and flux. Christian philosopher Cornelius Van Til argued throughout his career that the mind of self-proclaimed autonomous man cannot find an answer to this problem. Either stability is destroyed by change, or else change is really an illusion, and there is only the unity of stability. This is why creation scientists and Darwinian evolutionists go from one position to the other, from historical change to eternal law, to defend their respective systems, and ultimately, each position is held by means of a logic-destroying dialectical tension. This is why the debate over evolution and creation cannot be solved by an appeal to the brute facts of autonomous science. This is also why the apologetic method, empiricism, the appeal to supposed common facts, of the scientific creationist movement is flawed. It appeals to a hypothetical common logic of man as if such a common ground existed. But men interpret all facts in terms of their religious presuppositions. The inability of either side to convince its opponents testifies to the futility of the search for common facts, common theories, or common anything else. The futility of the attempt to get creation science into the public schools has not been recognized by these dedicated men, despite 20 years of failure in the courts and the state textbook committees, precisely because they still really believe in the myth of scientific neutrality, the appeal to a commonly shared body of scientific opinion. There is no shared body of opinion. There is only warfare over whose all-or-nothing system will be used in the classroom. The Darwinists, being more consistent, have triumphed. They will not tolerate equal time for God. Rates of change. The debate over uniformitarianism goes beyond the question of the fixed laws of nature. It also relates to rates of change in history. Pure uniformitarianism argues that rates of geological or biological change are always the same. There are very few scientists who hold such a view. Very few ever have. They always fudge when pressed. They qualify their claim. This is why the debate over uniformitarianism is so curious. Historically, Darwinism grew out of the 19th century concept of uniformitarian change. Historian-sociologist Robert Nisbet has identified the doctrine of uniformitarianism as the key doctrine in the attempt of 19th century evolutionists to challenge Christianity. Quote, "It is hard today to realize the degree to which the attack on Christianity obsessed intellectuals of rationalist and utilitarian will. Christianity had much the same position that capitalism was to hold in the first half of the 20th century. It was the enemy in the minds of most intellectuals. Uniformitarianism, above any other single element of the theory of evolution, was the perfect point of attack on a theory that made external manipulation its essence and a succession of quote-unquote catastrophes its plot." End quote. Ironically, today's scientific creationists have presented their case against Darwinian evolution in terms of uniformitarianism, specifically the doctrine of the unchanging entropy law, which they do not really and truly believe is unchanging, i.e., miracles. Both sides appeal to the same law in order to make their case. We therefore need to explore the implications of this debate, a debate based officially on entropy. The curse of entropy. The scientific creationists build their case against Darwinian evolution in terms of the post-fall curse, God's judgment on the cosmos, entropy. This is their version of uniformitarianism, meaning a process of change which is the same today as it was yesterday. Every science needs certain models, meaning fixed reference points that explain and measure change. The scientific creationists argue that all scientists must build the foundation of science on the inescapable, universal, irreversible law of entropy. Entropy is inescapable. It is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Well, not quite the same, as we shall see, but usually it is the same. They then argue that the closed box aspect of the universe cannot possibly be true, given the assumptions of the Darwinists. The universe was not a self-created entity. It could not have evolved in the random way that the Darwinians claim. Such a development is not mathematically possible, according to the laws of probability. God must have created the world, for there is no way to explain the coming of life in a world governed by the second law of thermodynamics. When man rebelled, God cursed the universe. This curse, quote-unquote, from the outside, is the origin of the law of entropy, not nature itself. So runs the argument. Henry Morris has openly praised the methodology of uniformitarianism. Quote, "But there is obviously no way of knowing that these processes and the laws which describe them have always been the same in the past, or that they will always be the same in the future. It is possible to make an assumption of this kind, of course, and this is the well-known principle of uniformitarianism. The assumption is reasonable in the light of our experience with present processes, and it is no doubt safe to extrapolate on this basis for a certain time into the future and back into the past. But to insist that uniformitarianism is the only scientific approach to the understanding of all past and future time is clearly nothing but a dogmatic tenet of a particular form of religion." End quote. He meant this last sentence to apply to modern Darwinists who reject miracles. But the best of the Darwinian scientists never held to such a rigid definition of the doctrine, since they, too, need ways to escape the limits of a fixed-rate system of geological and biological change. And today we find a scientific revolution going on in the Darwinian camp, primarily because of the quote-unquote macroevolution theories associated with Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould. How then can the scientific creationists distinguish themselves methodologically, quote, uniformitarianism most of the time, end quote, from the new quote-unquote modified uniformitarian Darwinian evolutionists who despise the Christian faith as much as the older ones did. The Darwinists respond. Darwinian evolutionists are unimpressed by any Christian appeal to a most-of-the-time version of the entropy law. In response to the creationists' view of the open box, a universe created by God and continually open to God and His miracles, the Darwinian uniformitarians still argue for the closed-box theory of the universe. They deny the Christian doctrine of creation, no creator God of the Bible, no six-day creation, no perpetually binding ethics, and no final judgment, especially no final judgment. They defend themselves against the uniformitarian law of entropy by arguing that there are local or regional open boxes in which energy received from outside the region has sometimes been able to produce increasing complexity and order, thereby temporarily overcoming the universal macroevolutionary tendency toward simplicity and randomness, which ultimately means macrodevolution, the final extinction of life and differentiation. It also means the extinction of man, his hopes, dreams, and meaning. Evolutionists cling religiously to a cosmology of death in preference to a cosmology of God-produced regeneration and cosmic renewal. This is as it should be. All those who hate God love death. Proverbs 8:36b. Energy, for the Darwinian evolutionist, is substituted for the Creator God, an impersonal, purposeless force of nature which produces personal, purposeful living beings, and ultimately man, the only known agent capable of providing cosmic purposefulness for the universe. Living beings, by means of energy transformation, can temporarily overcome some of the effects of entropy locally, though not for the universe as a whole. Both sides in this debate agree that the effects of entropy can be overcome by such processes as photosynthesis in plants. Both sides believe that man, through purposeful planning and work, can create quote-unquote pockets of order at some price in a decreasingly orderly universe. Neither the scientific creationists nor the Darwinians believe that these pockets of order can perpetually withstand the entropy process. The scientific creationists believe that the intervention of God at the final judgment will overthrow the law of entropy, the curse of the cosmos. Darwinians, at least those who write for the general public, believe that the entropy process will finally destroy all life in the final dissipation of energy. In short, the universe ultimately faces either an absolute God, absolute destruction, or an endless series of meaningless cycles. The biblical view. What is the biblical view of uniformitarianism? The Bible teaches the uniformitarianism of God's being and character. For I am the Lord, I change not, Malachi 3:6. His law reflects His character. The principles of God's ethical law are fixed. We do not look to nature to find unchanging principles or laws, for nature is cursed. We look instead to God and His law. Here is the grave error of the scientific creationists. They deliberately, self-consciously begin their scientific discussions without any reference to God in the Bible, let alone His fixed ethical law. This strategic error is the product of a self-conscious attempt to get creationist materials into the public schools. Henry Morris includes a section, The Battle for the Public School, in his book Evolution in Turmoil. It is an approach based self-consciously on the presupposition, equal time for Satan. Morris says forthrightly, quote, Creationists in no way wish to control public school curricula, of course, but they have been urging school administrators to be fair and to use a two-model approach in the schools, end quote. It is an attempt which has been unsuccessful. See Appendix B. Discussing scientific models without an appeal to the Bible may produce acceptable short-term results in short formal debates, but it has not convinced the courts or the teachers of evolution. The public schools are not going to teach six-day creation, and any expenditure of resources to try to get them to do it is a waste of our very limited resources. Our goal as self-conscious Christians and six-day creationists is not to sneak our highly religious perspective into the public schools by means of a cloak of supposed neutrality. There can be no neutrality. Thus, our goal is not to teach religion in the public schools. It is to shut down all tax money going to every school, except the military academies. We should not baptize the public schools by making them appear sort of all right to Christians who don't know any better. The proper Christian goal, of course, should be to shut down the public schools and never again allow taxpayers' money to be used to educate children. Our cry should be, no more socialism in education. This quote-unquote evidentialist approach to science and everything else denies the fundamental starting point of all God-honoring intellectual investigations. God as the sovereign creator of the universe, meaning the creator-creature distinction. Continuity versus discontinuity. Each side appeals to a discontinuity to overcome the other side's supposed continuity. Each side also uses continuity to overcome the other side's supposed discontinuity. The debate begins. Discontinuity. Let us begin with the arguments for discontinuity, exceptions to the universal reign of uniformitarianism. Both sides need exceptions to the uniformitarian principle of entropy. The scientific creationists allow for miracles, while the Darwinians allow for increasing order of evolutionary development, a temporary discontinuity in the entropy process. The scientific creationists say that God overcomes entropy occasionally by intervening in history. A purposeful God created a purposeful universe, and he occasionally annuls entropy, a curse, for his own purposes. They admit that miracles are an exception to entropy, and therefore unscientific. But they argue that the Darwinians have also been unscientific by affirming a temporary and unexplainable discontinuity called evolution, increasing order in an entropic world of decreasing order. But to argue this way, they have to equate the process of entropy with the second law of thermodynamics, and the second law with science itself. Writes Henry Morris, quote, "As a matter of fact, thermodynamics could practically be considered as synonymous with science, since its concepts and laws embrace all scientific processes in all scientific disciplines." End quote. I should think that the same could be said of gravity, or any number of other scientific laws. Science is not everything there is, for God is the non-entropic Lord of the universe. But whatever science is, it must rest on entropy as its foundation. Therefore, they say the Darwinists are not truly scientific. Darwinists want their exception to entropy, evolution, to remain within the framework of science, not outside it. This is cheating, say the scientific creationists. The Darwinians reply that meaningless, zero-purpose, order-producing, unplanned and unplanning, entropy-reversing energy from outside a regional entropy-bound system can produce, and has produced, regional evolution. They say that this exception really is not a true exception to the second law of thermodynamics. A temporary overcoming of entropy is legitimate, so long as we maintain that entropy wins out in the end, or at least just before the universe reverses itself and begins to contract. This seeming discontinuity really is not a true discontinuity. They say that they alone are truly scientific, since the discontinuities of Christian history are totally unscientific. They know that evolution must be a valid part of a world of entropy because God just cannot be. Both sides want to stand on solid scientific ground, meaning that both sides feel compelled to appeal to one temporarily valid anti-uniformitarian process in order to overcome the implications of the other side's system. Each side says, in effect, my discontinuity is better than your discontinuity. So much for the exceptions, the discontinuities, to the continuity of uniformitarianism. Continuity. Now let us look at the use of the argument from uniformitarian continuity against the other side's continuity. The scientific creationists use their temporary, post-fall, pre-resurrection, universal law of entropy to prove that there could never have been uniformitarian, Darwinian, unplanned evolutionary development. They use one form of uniformitarianism, entropy, to refute another kind of uniformitarianism, upward-moving, increasingly ordered evolutionary progress within an increasingly random universe. They argue that the evolutionists' discontinuity of life's origins, above all, cannot be explained within the framework of the uniformity of entropy. They use the uniformity of entropy to refute the Darwinians' version of the discontinuity of life's origin, as well as to refute the supposed uniformity of upward evolutionary development. The Darwinians also want a particular type of uniformitarianism, and they also must admit that it is temporary, the process of evolution. Someday, entropy's cold, dead hand will crush all regional, temporary evolutionary processes. Most evolutionists are presently hesitant to throw out the concept of uniformitarian entropy, which is postulated today as being as old as the universe, but they may be willing to abandon or radically modify the idea in the future. They want regional escape hatches from entropy's randomness in order to explain the process of evolution, regional open boxes that are temporarily, billions of years, sustained by energy sources outside the region. Darwinians used the idea of uniformitarian regional evolutionary processes, admittedly processes of limited duration, to modify the idea of uniformitarian universal entropy. They want this form of uniformitarianism to refute the supposed discontinuities, anti-uniformitarianism of the Christians, creation, miracles, and the Noahic flood, and above all, the discontinuity of final judgment. The Christians ultimately argue for a world of final discontinuity. The Christians proclaim cosmic restoration at the final judgment, a day that will inaugurate a new era of uniformitarianism, peace without curses. The Darwinists ultimately argue for a world of continuity. They prefer the uniformitarian heat death of the universe, the result of triumphant entropy, to God's discontinuous day of triumphant final judgment. Stability versus change. It appears that while we all need fixed reference points in order to discuss historical change, none of us can tolerate the rule of such an inflexible monarch. We cannot seem to discover processes in nature that change at absolutely fixed rates over time. The scientific creationists want occasional miracles, the Darwinian evolutionists want occasional catastrophes, and the theonomists want Old Testament, New Testament changes in administration or application of God's fixed ethical law. Every philosophy has to come to grips with the problem of change within a framework of stability. The Bible teaches that God is the fixed reference point, that His law is the unchanging rule, and that both man and nature develop in history in terms of God's providential plan. It is the fundamental epistemological error of the entropists, Darwinian, New Age, and scientific creationists, that they look to nature rather than to God as their source of stable principles of understanding. They see entropy as the universally agreed-upon principle of scientific understanding, and sometimes also of historical understanding. Their religious and theological presuppositions govern their selection of a uniformitarian standard. Open and closed boxes. The Darwinists and the scientific creationists have their own respective doctrines of open and closed boxes. Darwinians want uncreated open boxes, regions, open outward, meaning regions that are open to nearby sources of order-producing energy, but always within the ethically and metaphysically closed box of the universe. Modern humanism's universe is closed by definition to the God of the Bible. The scientific creationists want a created open box universe. Open upward, meaning a universe which gained its original order and energy from outside itself, but which is now dissipating both order and energy. The Darwinians want to deny the existence of an open box universe upward, while the creationists want to deny the evolutionary significance of the existence of open boxes, regions, outward. The Darwinians want to extract order and social blessings from impersonal energy. This energy is transformed impersonally by chance and plants, and transformed personally by man into man-benefiting products. They now want to use biological science to create new life forms that will transform even more energy into man-benefiting products, a vision which horrifies New Age polemicist Jeremy Rifkin. The scientific creationists have generally remained silent about such world-transforming developments by modern science. This silence makes them appear socially irrelevant. However, since they are personally convinced that entropy rules life, and that evil will triumph before Christ returns to set up His kingdom, they do not expect scientific discoveries to change either the downward entropic drift of the universe or the downward moral drift of civilization. They do not believe that the world's openness upward to God will have any permanent positive effects, at least not before a future millennium, in which Christ appears physically to rule the nations, accompanied by resurrected saints who no longer are under the curse of entropy. even though everyone else on Earth is. Conclusion. What we find is that both sides appeal to entropy, and both sides also deny it. Both sides claim to be uniformitarians, and both sides deny it. The scientific creationists want entropy to rule unchallenged, except when miracles are involved. The Darwinians also want entropy to rule, but they also want an exception, sunshine evolution. But how did the sun get here? In terms of the evolutionists' own presuppositions, we need to ask, how did a supposedly impersonal, undesigned cosmic order that is characterized by increasing randomness ever produce an orderly energy source, the sun, that in turn created pockets of increasing biological order? How long did this process take? What probability can be assigned that the sun's rays made life emerge from non-life? This is what scientific creationists keep asking. They do not get straight answers. Discovering an explanation for getting order out of disorder is the top priority scientific problem for all evolutionary systems, whether physical science or social science. Discovering a program or process for preserving order is the second problem. How does society preserve order if the entropy law is valid? By an appeal to God and his miracles? By an appeal to sunlight and its temporary escape hatch? Or as the mystics would have it, by an appeal to a pantheistic God who is both totally immersed in and yet totally divorced from this world's reality, which they see as Maya, or unreality? Why all this technical discussion of cosmology? Because cosmologies have implications for every aspect of human thought and action. We find that the doctrine of origins has implications for our doctrine of finality, which in turn has implications for our doctrine of immediate ethics, not to mention our doctrine of social reality. We find that creationists and evolutionists debate questions of social theory by using arguments remarkably similar to the arguments that they use against each other in the field of cosmology. This book is concerned with social theory, so I was forced to devote part of it to cosmology.